No one really knows what the end game is, but we're definitely seeing it come apart at the seams.
Hello there from Bedford, UK. How are you all? Welcome to the What Bitcoin Did podcast, which is brought to you by the mighty Kraken, the best place to buy, sell, and trade Bitcoin. I'm your host, Peter McCormack, and today I've got another monster panel from Real Vision. I've got Nic Carter, Tuur Demeester, Robert Breedlove, and Alex Leishman, where I ask what is next for Bitcoin. But before that, I do have a message from my amazing sponsors. So first up, we have BlockFi, the future of Bitcoin and financial services. So with BlockFi, you can open up an interest account, start earning money on your Bitcoin, and you can use your Bitcoin as collateral and take out a USD loan. And right now, they've got a badass special offer for new customers. You can get double interest bonus if you fund your BlockFi account by July the 18th. That means for the month of August, you'll be earning twice as much as normal. All you have to do is enter the promo code 2X when signing up. Just enter the number 2 followed by an X. That's promo code 2X. If you want to find out more, head over to blockfi.com, which is blockfi.com. Also, let's talk about Kraken and why they are the very best place for buying Bitcoin. Firstly, they have world-class security. That means they are the most trusted cryptocurrency exchange on the market. You can go out there, you can look at lots of other exchanges, but they are the most trusted. No hacker is going to get your Bitcoin out of your Kraken account. And with their 24/7, 365 customer support, whatever issue you have, wherever you are, they are going to help you out. And they have the most comprehensive suite of tools for buying Bitcoin. At Kraken.com, it could not be easier to sign up and start buying. And with their beautiful mobile-first app, you can buy Bitcoin on the go. So if you're down the pub, if you're having a socially distanced beer, now the pubs have ended their lockdown, and you're thinking, you know what? I want some more Bitcoin. You can do it there, on the go. And with their margin trading, futures, and OTC desk, Kraken has every option covered for you. There is no better place to trade Bitcoin. Find out more at Kraken.com or download the app, which is available for the iPhone and Android. Just search for Kraken Pro, which is KrakenPro. All right, so onto the show, and this is another panel from Real Vision's virtual conference, the Crypto Gathering. Last week, I put out a panel held with Rao Powell, Caitlin Long, and Travis Kling, which was a massive episode, so I highly recommend you giving that one a listen. The team at Real Vision gave me free reign to host these panels on whatever topics I wanted to cover and release them out on my show, and they're both monsters. So this one, when they came to me, they said, look, we've got Nic Carter, Tuur Demeester, Robert Breedlove, and Alex Leishman. What do you want to discuss? I was like, fuck, that is a panel. We've really got to use this opportunity. So I was like, you know what? I want to talk about what's next for Bitcoin. We've got this crazy, broader economic situation going on right now, and I want to talk about where Bitcoin fits into this. We have mass awareness. Anywhere I go, when people are like, hey man, what do you do for a living? And I'm like, I've got a Bitcoin podcast. Nobody asks what Bitcoin is anymore. They say they don't understand it. They're like, what the fuck is that? I don't get it. Is it a scam? But nobody ever says, I've never heard of that. So we have mass awareness. So I want to talk about what are the challenges for adoption? What are the challenges for getting people over the line? So in this panel, we discuss the barriers to entry, Bitcoin's value proposition, and how it fits into the current economic situation and what the future holds. It was fascinating to have all these amazing minds in Bitcoin together to discuss these subjects. We do get in some of the key properties of Bitcoin, but it does stay quite top level. The conference was aimed at Bitcoiners, but it was also aimed at broader people interested in finance and money. So yeah, I tried to keep it top level, but I hope you enjoy this. I think it's a monster. You got any questions, got any feedback? You know you can hit me up. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com. Just a couple of closing notes. I do want you to check out my other show, Defiance. Got loads of cool interviews and mini documentaries there. That's it, defiance.news. And I also need to shout out and big thanks to my buddy Luke Martin. I've been playing poker with him every week, and he's kindly been donating his Bitcoin to me. So big thanks to you, Luke. Thanks every week for coming on, playing and donating me your Bitcoin. All right, hope you enjoy the show. Have a great weekend, and I will see you soon. Right, we're live. Hello, everyone. An amazing panel we've got here. We're joined by Nic Carter from Castle Island Ventures, someone I've interviewed a few times. We got Tuur Demeester, also been on my show a bunch of times. Robert Breedlove, I recently interviewed for the first time recently. And Alex, we had dinner in San Francisco recently, but I've never actually interviewed you. So when Real Vision approached me about sessions to do, I came up with two ideas. One I did yesterday, and then based on this panel, I kind of like the idea of kind of what now for Bitcoin. And one of the things I've talked about quite regularly to people, especially as I travel quite a lot with my podcast, I very rarely meet anyone who's not heard of Bitcoin. So we've hit a mass awareness stage. Whenever I meet somebody randomly, it can be in an airport or a bar, whatever, and they say, what do you do? I say, I have a Bitcoin podcast. I never get the question, oh, what's Bitcoin? It never happens. but I do get a range of answers, and some people skeptical, some people inquisitive. So we've reached mass awareness. Everyone has heard of Bitcoin now. So I'm kind of interested in like what's next. I don't really want to use the term mass adoption because I think that's a loaded point, but I do want to see more adoption and more use case. So I want to work through that today, and I've got a number of questions, and I will direct them to each of you. And I think I'll probably just start with Tuur because you're in the top left of my screen. So Tuur, a starting point for me is I think there is a big gulf between someone like any of us who has a very deep understanding of Bitcoin, and then maybe one of these people I randomly meet who has heard of Bitcoin, but they don't really understand it. There's a huge gulf there. And I'm starting personally to think that perhaps in some ways Bitcoin has a reputation problem. Not even that it's just a negative reputation, but it has a problem in trying to explain to people what it is because it is so complicated. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there is a bit of a reputation problem. And also, I think Bitcoin has been misunderstood. Like, Bitcoin has stayed itself. Like, it hasn't really changed in a long time, like since inception, basically. But I think the narratives around it, and Nic has actually done some good work around that, the narratives around it have changed. And early on, Bitcoin was often promoted as this kind of e-cash, the kind of some kind of currency to spend online. And I think to some extent that was misguided. I think Bitcoin is much more of a digital gold. And once you start looking at it that way, that the scarcity, the censorship resistance, that's really the highlight, then some of the speculative interest changes. Like, there's less short-term interest. So I think that's been an important part. And then in the short term, like, why hasn't there been more interest? I think the short answer is just that the price has been pretty much flat for 2.5 years, but it has been very volatile also. And so that scares retail people. And also, I mean, if you're in a hedge fund and you're like momentum driven, like you might get scared as well because you see these 50% crashes happen. But yeah, I mean, I think that the appeal going forward is just, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is massive, and it's becoming more and more interesting as we see more and more money creation all around the world. It really shows Bitcoin is shining as a scarce asset and a liquid asset. That's really important. And of course, censorship resistance is now more than ever going to be interesting for people to have.
Yeah, I think the change in narratives is something that Plan B actually highlighted within his model that we've all been looking at recently. And Nic, Tuur mentioned you there, so I'll let you jump in next. Any thoughts on Bitcoin's reputation?
Yeah, it's interesting. Tuur said it. Bitcoin is largely static, and the world changes around it. The way that people perceive Bitcoin has changed. Initially, it wasn't really suitable for much aside from spending on, alpaca socks and stuff. And as time has gone on, it's gained credibility, and it really has potentially staked out a claim as this new synthetic commodity, which people call digital gold for short. But yeah, it's kind of difficult to define. I think Bitcoin just chugs along, and it has, certain qualities that make it an asset which people really desire. They try and get a piece of, but it resists classification. And I think trying to narrow it down too much is an exercise in frustration. There are definitely people that have specific opinions of what it should be and how it should be used. And those people tend to get frustrated and desert the project for alternatives. I think the important thing is staying consistent with the original values, the kind of constitutional values that were embedded in it at inception, and resisting, political discretion, resisting lobbying, arbitrary changes, which we see all over the place in the kind of public blockchain space. As long as it can do that, stay true to its supply schedule, keep its core properties intact, I think over time is just going to undertake and continue to carry out this process of monetization, which it has been doing for a full decade now. So it's just a function of staying static as the world gets more chaotic around it.
And how about you, Alex? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I really agree with Nic. I think that Bitcoin means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Everyone knows about it. And this year, I think, especially with the Fed's actions and the increasing political instability, especially in the United States, Bitcoin is kind of this weirdly stable thing that's just been chugging along for the last 10 years, one block at a time. And people have been watching it for the last few years, aware of it, and have expected it to blow up, and it hasn't. And, every block that gets added to the chain becomes one more, sign that this thing isn't going away. And I think, as time goes on and as Bitcoin continues to live, more and more people are going to continue to take the plunge and actually allocate some of their assets to it. And so, with our clients, we see people buying for a lot of different reasons, but the primary one right now has been because of all of the Fed money printing. But a few years ago, people were buying it for other reasons.
And Robert, yourself, the man who writes blogs, which could be books, how do you feel about Bitcoin's reputation?
I would agree with everything that's been said, and I think the concept of Bitcoin actually supersedes money in a lot of ways. But we could zero in on just the concept of money and say that people don't understand that in general. And I think that's very connected to the curriculum that we've all come up under. The Austrian economics is not part of state-run curriculum. And Bitcoin really is a first principles disruption to money. Money needs to do 5 things. It needs to be durable, divisible, portable, recognizable, scarce. Not many people understand that. And because Bitcoin is superior across all 5 properties, it's actually disruptive to gold. So we're talking about disrupting a technology that's been with us for 5,000 years. So it's a big, not to be cliche, but a really major paradigm shift. And I agree that because it's agnostic to politics, the more chaos that's going on in the world, the more money is being printed, that the neutral settlement layer will capture all of that value. And, clearly Bitcoin's far and away the leader in that space. And, from just a reputational standpoint, Bitcoin's a peaceful protest wrapped in a get-rich-quick scheme, basically. The more people that are marginalized by the state, I think, find their way into Bitcoin. And that's just what's feeding its growth in the medium and long term.
The reason I asked it is that, as you know, I've got a show and I've pretty much interviewed everyone, and I'm trying to expand now into getting involved in conversations with people who aren't in the wild. And I'm almost avoiding mentioning it's a Bitcoin show because I'm fearful of the reactions it brings out in people. And one of the most interesting shows I heard recently, did you all hear Vijay Boyapati on Tom Woods? So what the really interesting start of that point is Tom Woods, being a libertarian, you would think naturally loves Bitcoin, and he's covered Bitcoin. But he said, you just lose me. You peer-to-peer, what? Nodes, what? He said, you just lose me. But what was really good is he asked VJ to explain Bitcoin. And it's actually something when I try and do myself, I really struggle to just instantly think, well, how do you actually explain Bitcoin? There is simple ways, but we often get lost in it. I'll start with you, Robert, because we talked about this over Telegram over the last few days. What would you explain Bitcoin? How would you explain what Bitcoin is?
I always tell people the rabbit, so to speak, that takes you down the rabbit hole is that question, what is money? I think you really have to pursue that question assiduously to get a good answer. And I think you land on that Austrian economic bedrock of why gold became money. And people assign this a lot of characteristics. I narrow it down to 5, which makes sense in my mind, that I've already laid out. But I think once you answer that question and you understand why gold was selected on the free market, that gives you the lens through which to evaluate Bitcoin properly. Not to say that captures all of what Bitcoin is, because it also adds a lot of other things. It gives us this mechanism for monetizing surplus energy. It's the most securable money in history. So it's more or less theft proof if properly secured. And when you have government business models that are premised on theft via inflation and taxation, it's disruptive to that business model. So I think it's this major force shifting us away from the monopolistic business practices in the market for money that we see with government, pushing us back toward a free market paradigm in the world.
I think you made an interesting point when you mentioned that we aren't taught Austrian economics at school, and we don't really learn money. Money is like a language, it's like breathing. It's just something we naturally learn as a child, and we don't tend to really think about it. But perhaps maybe if you're living in Lebanon right now, you are thinking about it, or Zimbabwe right now, you are thinking about it, and you have done in Argentina. And Nic, how important do you think that is Do you think as we see a natural flight to the dollar, we're going to see more currency collapses around the world? Do you think it's going to be a more natural lead into Bitcoin for people?
I always find it funny that people challenge Bitcoiners to point out examples of fiat currencies failing when you just have to look at the front page of the Financial Times to find recent examples of currency collapse. It's literally happening in Lebanon right now. Argentina just defaulted for the 9th time. Places like Turkey and Iran are experiencing high inflation. Venezuela and Zimbabwe are in a complete state of currency collapse. So you don't have to look far. And crucially, you don't just have to look for, the most desperate nations with terrible governance. You have to look at middle income nations, which because of the capriciousness of the state and mismanagement, their currencies collapse and the savings of regular middle class folks got confiscated, savings they've accumulated over decades. Lebanon is not a poor nation. It is firmly in the middle of the pack. And now, regular folks in Lebanon have their savings completely obliterated because of the currency failure. So, we're not talking about hypotheticals here. We're talking about something that affects tens of millions of people around the world. I would say having an unreliable currency is the default globally. Having a reliable currency like the dollar is the exception. And even the dollar itself is inflationary, as we know. Most people globally don't really have access to the dollar. So, when you're looking at it from the US perspective or from a British or kind of a Western European perspective, you're not experiencing the typical monetary state of affairs for a human being on planet Earth. So I think that's why you have a rejection of these chaos hedges or these inflation hedges like Bitcoin in the West a lot of the time. People don't understand. Sometimes you see a bit of an Anglocentrism in this rejection of Bitcoin. Why would people be afraid of their government? Why would they fear currency collapse? Well, there's plenty of good reasons if you're willing to look abroad. And that's not to say it can't happen in the US either. We're living in the twilight waning days of Pax Americana of the US empire. We've had a very peaceful 100 years here. That's not the historical norm. A fiat currency regime with effectively a single global reserve currency, that is not the historical norm by any means. For the most part, we've had gold as the reserve currency. We've not had a currency that was controlled by the state. So this U.S. empire, which has been a sprawling power, since 1940, it certainly looks to be in decline. And I don't think we're going to have the benefit of this stability in perpetuity. So it's only reasonable to look to alternatives. And I think Bitcoin is a pretty valid one.
When I was in Argentina and I was talking about Bitcoin to people there, it was actually a very easy conversation to have. As they'd been through La Corralita, they understood that a currency can collapse and it can be seized by the government. You four are obviously based in the States. Tuur, you're originally from Belgium, right? I'm from the UK. I really struggle, despite the fact that we can see this happening around the world in Lebanon and Zimbabwe right now, struggle to explain to people the risks themselves. Tuur, do you believe in first world countries, do you believe in places, most of Europe, the US, the UK, we all believe we're immune from a currency collapse?
Yeah, and I don't, you could call it hubris, like, we're the West and we're fine, which, has been proven to not be enough. Like, Germany was considered to be a strong economic power, and they did have a currency, even, in the 1910s, and then they did have the currency collapse in 1920 with the hyperinflation, and the same with France before the French Revolution. People thought, France is credit worthy. All the European nations were lending it money, and it still currency collapsed. But I think there's also a deficit, a real shortage of knowledge. Because, even, if I look at my own backyard, like Operation Good was a currency devaluation right after the Second World War. Like, nobody knows this. It's like that. This is recent history. And like Britain had a devaluation of over 30% after the Second World War. So like these things are not, they're not uncommon at all, but financial history is just not part of our curriculum growing up. And it's just sad. It's sad that there's only a small percentage of the population and, people subscribing to things like Real Vision that are actually sufficiently educated in how these things go. So yeah, I would definitely add that but there is a kind of a blindness in the West that like we just assume we're going to keep chugging along just like we have the past 40 years.
I also think not a lot of people really understand the impact of money printing as we're going through these very strange lockdowns. And I know in the UK, our government is printing hundreds of billions of dollars. In the US, it's been trillions of dollars. I don't think people really understand the impact or what that really means. Are you finding similar, Alex, when you talk to people about this outside of our world?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually say that, in my experience, the wealthiest people out there actually do understand this quite well, and they see what's happening. They've had the luxury of, a lot of education, kind of seeing history. People ask me about Executive Order 6102, and they want to know, if I keep my Bitcoin at an institution, will the government be able to take it, right? Because the people are starting to see some of the writing on the wall. They're starting to get concerned, especially in the upper classes. I think it's really more kind of the mainstream people who, haven't had the luxury of, studying financial history and all that stuff that don't really see what's going on. And they're angry, but they don't really know exactly kind of how to frame that. And so, most of my family, right? They've never lived in a world where the US dollar wasn't this thing that you just can rely on. Right. And I think even most companies and most people, in the professional world have just lived in a world where the dollar is king. The dollar will always be this unit of account. It's stable. It's there. And they don't even want to start to think about questioning that. It's uncomfortable. And so I do think that there's a long way to go, but coming back to kind of the original question of, what resonates with people? What is the single biggest thing about Bitcoin that could resonate with somebody who doesn't spend all day thinking about monetary economics, right? And in my experience, it's been scarcity, right? There's only ever going to be 21 million of these things. And people get that, right? Okay. Because now the human instinct kind of goes, okay, well, I kind of want some just in case. Right. And I've seen that to be kind of the most, the thing that resonates most with people who aren't kind of deep in this world is explaining that there's only ever going to be this amount. And, if you want any, you should get some now.
Sure.
Just very briefly, as a way to visualize it, because people talk sometimes about the Bitcoin island, and you kind of claim your little stake on that island. If you look at all urbanized land in the world, I think it's like 3.6 million square kilometers, and you divide that by 21 million, you end up with 41 acres. So just as a way to visualize it, it's like, owning one Bitcoin is the equivalent of owning 41 acres of urbanized land somewhere in the world.
Wow, I didn't know that. I'll be stealing that one. Okay, Robert. So it's a big year for Bitcoin potentially. I mean, I think in our heads it is. We're seeing this massive increase in the deficits in most countries, and we're seeing this massive increase in government spending. At the same time, facing economic problems, potential recessions, even depressions. So it's a big year for Bitcoin, but there's never really consensus on what are the most important trends for Bitcoin. And I think that's where some battles come, because I think they conflict with each other. But do you want to talk about what you see as the biggest trends for this year? And I'll run this through everyone, and I'll keep a note here, and then we can work through them.
Well, I think we were just touching on one is, the rate of fiat currency production worldwide is clearly an accelerant for Bitcoin. In the US, M2 production, I think, has increased 12x in the past 6 months. We've basically expanded the M2 supply $3 trillion, say, in the past 6 months. The last 4 months, sorry. The last $3 trillion before that took 4 years, right? And we're accelerating. It's important to remember that the entire economic order is basically a leverage-based system. It requires steadily more leverage to remain sustainable. So it's really hard to contract the balance sheet for central banks. And I really think if you look at the 1980 graph, M2 is full on parabolic. We're at a parabolic, possibly blow off top of some kind here. And to me, that just indicates that we're towards the end game. No one really knows what the end game is, but we're definitely seeing it come apart at the seams, right? Like the Fed's buying everything. It's become essentially a glorified hedge fund. Fiscal and monetary policy's been pushed to the furthest reaches of its exotic forms. And there's clearly social upheaval as a result. Like all these things that we know empirically happen when a currency breaks down, like trust is eliminated or trust is compromised and society starts to come apart. I think that's a major trend. Another one that is not talked about a lot is because Bitcoin provides a mechanism for converting underused or unused energy sources directly into a globally transactable commodity. There's going to be huge demand for that from like over leveraged energy producers and frankly anyone that has access to these types of resources. So, we're talking to one executive with a publicly traded utility in West Texas, and I love the way he put this. He said the entire North American energy infrastructure, energy grid, was designed for a single hot afternoon in August. Basically saying that there's just tremendous amounts of slack and potential for excess energy production in the system. And, so like their wind farms, sometimes they're like peaking at night, peak production's at night, but peak demand is in the day. And a lot of that energy is just getting curtailed. It's not getting used. So now Bitcoin, just by co-locating Bitcoin mining with these wind farms, you can directly increase their revenue, say 4 to 7%, at basically no cost to them. And then for the Bitcoin miner, they get access to wholesale energy markets. So it's a real win-win that I think is going to contribute a lot to demand. And again, I'm just focused on North America, but I'm sure this is the case worldwide. But that's going to be a big force driving Bitcoin adoption.
Yeah, I can jump in here.
I was just going to add another one you mentioned to me as well. Is like the gold disruption.
The disruption in gold markets.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was actually kind of relevant to the point I was going to make. So you have exogenous factors like massive currency printing, which is most likely going to result in devaluation. So that's kind of external to Bitcoin, but that obviously affects the way that the world perceives Bitcoin. And then you sort of have endogenous factors. So things that are contained to the Bitcoin markets or the kind of Bitcoin crypto financial infrastructure, which, some of the folks on this panel are building or financing. And that is something which I think is a little underappreciated, treating Bitcoin not just as this kind of base commodity, which, kind of like gold sits in vaults, it doesn't do much. Bitcoin improves on that significantly in many dimensions and over several orders of magnitude. So gold is very difficult to audit, right? It's hard to prove to a third party that you own certain gold. And indeed, we've seen a massive scandal recently with all this counterfeit gold circulating in global markets. We've also seen this dislocation between the London and the New York gold markets because it's hard to transport gold, it's expensive, and they have different standards for what sorts of gold is suitable for each market. So the gold itself isn't fungible. It sits in these little walled gardens. And fundamentally, that's because gold is costly to transmit and it's hard to verify some inbound gold. You kind of have to re-verify it if it's exiting a trusted supply chain. Now with Bitcoin, that's not really a problem. Not only can I easily prove to you that I own some Bitcoin, you can prove to me cryptographically, I can also verify and audit the entire supply of all the Bitcoin that exists in the entire world. Now, that is something radically different compared to gold. With gold, we just have these vague estimates. Maybe we think there's $9 trillion worth of gold, circulating. With Bitcoin, we can verify down to the last Satoshi how many Bitcoins exist. And so this matters, I think, because now we have entities which are custodial entities, which are taking advantage of these properties. They're starting to prove to depositors that they have the Bitcoin they claim they own. It's also easier as a depositor to withdraw your coins, to take final settlement. That is what holds some of these custodial entities accountable. So we have them. We have custodians, banks, exchanges, brokers, and Bitcoin. I'm sure Alex can chime in here. But it's also easier as an individual to hold those kind of trusted middlemen accountable to withdraw your coins from them or demand that they prove their solvency on kind of a constant basis. And that's kind of an incremental shift, I think, coming to treat Bitcoin as this high power collateral, which is really, it really shines in that context relative to something like gold.
Just to jump in and add one specific
I was going to say,
example.
Alex, you should probably, if you're going to jump in there, because Nick referred to your business, not everyone listening will know that you run River Financial and what that is. So perhaps just explain what River Financial is. And also just, I think what Nick is alluding to there is that whole proof of reserves. Is this something you're doing or considering?
Yeah. So at River Financial, we service a lot of individual clients. So people come to us to buy Bitcoin, and we provide Bitcoin financial services to people all over the United States. So I kind of have a behind the scenes view of what's happening in the markets. And for me, the most interesting trend here is the individual and people who you never would have thought making allocations into Bitcoin. And I think that trend is going to continue and accelerate over the coming years. Everyone from 65-year-old women in the Midwest putting a large chunk of their savings, into Bitcoin, to the sophisticated East Coast investor making really large allocations. We're seeing, that all across the board, and I think that's going to continue. That's a very interesting story that I think, is kind of starting to be told, but is just starting to materialize. And then on the proof of reserves thing, in my experience, what a lot of people find very intriguing about Bitcoin is that even though it's this very intimidating thing that they're just, for people new to Bitcoin, it's very intimidating, but they're interested in getting started, and they've been waiting for somebody who can make it easy for them. And then they learn, oh, I can store this thing myself if I really want to. If I don't want to trust this company to hold my Bitcoin for me, I can hold it myself, or I can have some sort of proof that this company has my Bitcoin. And so they kind of are starting to see that there's this world that could exist where there's a lot more guarantees around their money. That they could work with the financial institution that they're choosing to trust, but they don't have to trust them, right? And we see a lot of interest there. So we see interest in not necessarily self-custodying today from our clients. Well, we have our sophisticated clients who do self-custody, but then the clients who are new to Bitcoin and really like that they can self-custody at some point once they get more comfortable with this stuff. And then with proof of reserves, this is something that we are very interested in providing someday. There's a lot of operational challenges with proof of reserves. There's a lot of pros and cons, and I'd be happy to talk about those. But yeah, being able to prove to somebody cryptographically that you have their assets under management is very interesting to people.
Tuur, before I start diving into this, is there anything with regards to trends this year that we've not mentioned that you think may be an important trend over the next, say, 12 months?
Yeah, sure. But as a preface, I want to say, for anybody listening who's new to Bitcoin, it's totally fine to not be aware of any of the trends that are going on. Bitcoin is Bitcoin. It has been the same for 10 years. And ultimately, it's, what you can do with Bitcoin is a self-directed insurance policy. You can buy a little bit, and that's going to insure basically your entire asset portfolio against very particular risks. But that being said, I see as a trend, kind of based on what Alex is saying, and I agree with that, the auditability, but multi-sig storage, the idea that you can have multiple parties signing together to then make a transaction happen is really, really appealing. Also for, if you're thinking about inheritance strategies and things like that. But, it's not theoretically, you can really build a wallet that is stored on multiple continents. That's where it's going to go, is that ultimately, and this is basically the new offshore banking. That's really where we're heading to. So I think that's a major trend, and we're seeing significant adoption of this multi-sig technology. So I hadn't heard that. Derivatives markets are exploding, which I think is an important part of the institutionalization of Bitcoin, because it means that people who want, or institutions who want to get involved, can get very kind of sophisticated exposure. They can choose what type of exposure they get to this asset. Because, for example, if you just hold Bitcoin, you're facing that volatility. And so there's ways to deal with that. And so very conservative companies who may want to get involved in the Bitcoin space, but don't want the volatility, well, they can use futures and options to hedge themselves. Think about utility companies or mining companies or energy companies that want to get involved. They can, similar to how airlines, when they they get involved, in a way they have to be exposed to the oil market so they can buy oil, but then be hedged against the volatility. So anyway, I think derivatives are an important trend. And then what we'll also start seeing in 2020, 2021 is asset issuance on top of the Bitcoin network. So we'll see Bitcoin come into its own as more of an ecosystem, as almost like a financial internet. And the idea that for issuing a new asset, that you need a new token, that's going to go away. Like you're going to be able to do that within the Bitcoin ecosystem. So these ICOs are going to basically become just securities issuances in the same secure environment. And I'm talking about the liquid sidechain. There may be some other things in the works, but I think that's the contender for becoming the main platform where assets will be issued.
Next up, I talked to Nic, Tuur, Robert, and Alex more about what is next for Bitcoin. But before that, I've got a message from my amazing sponsors. Okay, Sportsbet. Have you checked out sportsbet.io yet? The best place for online gaming. And guess what? They accept Bitcoin. They're such Bitcoin badasses that they put a Bitcoin logo on a Premier League shirt, on Watford's shirt. So cool. Anyway, it is great to have football back. It was great to see Liverpool win the league. It's also great to have Serie A back and La Liga. It's just good to have football back. And with sportsbet.io, you have the chance to win big. You can take part in their weekly leaderboard promotion. You can win signed shirts by Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo. And you can claim cash prizes and free bets. If you want to find out more, head over to sportsbet.io/promotions. Sportsbet is SPORTSBET. Next up is my newest sponsor, Casa. They are the premier brand in Bitcoin security. I've been talking about this for a few weeks now. I'd let mine slip. I was worried. I was thinking, shit, I really need to get this together. So I reached out to the team. I was like, I'm going to sign up. I want to be a customer. So I did it. And you know what? I've got so much peace of mind now from 3 different angles. Firstly, I can't screw it up myself. Like if I lose a wallet or I lose a key, I'm safe because I can swap a key out. I can't get hacked because I've got a multi-sig in place, and I'm also protecting myself physically as I got my keys distributed. It was a bit of a process to go through, and I learned so much, but I'm so glad to have it in place. Now, I signed up as a Casa Platinum, which is $150 a month and gives me a 3 or 5 multi-sig. If you're interested in trying them out, they do also have a gold option, which is $10 a month. That will give you a more robust security protection for your Bitcoin. And with a single hardware wallet, you get triple the security protecting your Bitcoin. So it really is a no-brainer to improve your Bitcoin security. They've got a free 1-month trial. You can find that out at trial.keys.casa. And if you want to check out Platinum or Diamond, just head over to keys.casa, which is keys.casa. Nic, I'm going to point the next question at you. I don't know why I'm picking you, but, well, I think I do. But one of the biggest trends here, which Robert mentioned, is that Bitcoin is a great hedge, hopefully, against a lot of the government printing at the moment. I saw on Twitter today, it's essentially your chaos insurance. So there is an imperative right now for potentially a lot of people to consider Bitcoin, or there's going to become an imperative over the next 12 months where maybe there's going to be an urgency around people coming to Bitcoin. And perhaps with that there's going to have to be an acceptance. Do you think there's going to have to be acceptance that we might have to compromise some of our principles, perhaps around custody, perhaps around privacy, perhaps about people operating nodes? Because some people are just going to want to get exposure into Bitcoin and maybe won't have the time to become fully hardcore Bitcoiners who operate Tor and operate a node.
Yeah, I don't think people do have this list of requirements for being, like a dyed-in-the-wool card-carrying Bitcoiner. I think that's, frankly, irrelevant for most people that have exposure to Bitcoin. There's a lot of ways to engage with the asset in a fully custodial way, in kind of a collaborative custody, or you can take full custody and run your own node. It's not going to be suitable for everybody to have the most kind of trustless, trust minimized experience where you're, broadcasting your own transactions. The important thing is that option exists for sure. And if the network becomes too difficult to run and too much data is being pushed through the network and it's basically impossible to run a node as a normal individual, then there's a failure that's occurred there. But as long as that optionality exists, I think it's absolutely fine for a certain set of people to engage with the network in a fully custodial manner, even through the lens of financial products, true intermediation. that's fine. In fact, that's how probably a good fraction of the world will want to engage with the asset. And it's unrealistic to expect everybody to run a node. As I said, I think the important thing is that the option remains to do that.
And how do you feel about this, Robert? And do you feel there's potential some conflicts here? Another one I would put out there is that this desire to take down central banks with Bitcoin, that requires this kind of horrible term, but mass adoption. It requires a lot more people to be exposed to Bitcoin. But in doing so, maybe we have to compromise some of our internal Bitcoin desires to have everybody transacting privately.
Well, to Nick's point, I think as long as the option is there, the ethos remains sound. Just to touch on, we talked about gold a little bit as being a driver for Bitcoin adoption. This story just broke yesterday that Wuhan King Gold, they had actually borrowed like $3 billion US over the past 5 years. And then when their creditors went to liquidate the collateral, they found that a lot of the gold was just copper, gilded copper, basically. Like that, I think more stories like that are just going to push demand into Bitcoin. Actually, I've said this before, I view the market cap for gold as pent up demand for Bitcoin. Again, the free market tends to zero in on truth, and we know that Bitcoin is objectively better than gold. And that's what makes it so interesting, because gold is, it's at the foundation of central banks. I mean, even though our dollar is not necessarily redeemable for gold, like the entire power structure is premised on controlling the gold supply. And, that's where you get, I guess, a bit more into the radical aspects of Bitcoin, like how it's disruptive to our concept of the nation state, how it's disruptive to central banking. Yeah, I think it's just where people's money goes, their mind tends to follow, and I've found that sort of speculators become holders over time. Holders become crazy guys like us. And it's interesting to see that aspect of the world playing out, because I think when you really start to look at history a little more deeply, I think it was Nietzsche said that he who has a why can bear any how. It's like, it's unbelievable to think that the state might actually lose its monopoly on money. It's never had that throughout all of history. But for the first time, there's a technology that can possibly drive that change. So it's a really interesting time to be alive.
Do we have any gold bugs here? Anyone here interested in gold? So an interesting point on
gold,
that,
right?
Yeah, I like gold.
Yeah, it's weird to me that Bitcoiners are always considered put forth as being opposed to gold. I think Bitcoin and gold are mutual technologies. People tend to have affection for both.
But on a long enough time frame, only one wins.
No, I think people are always going to want physical gold. There's like 5,000 years of accumulated cultural affinity for it. So I think they'll both exist.
Maybe here's one way to think. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Tuur.
It's just maybe one way to think about it, kind of going back to like the definition of Bitcoin. Like my shortest definition that I've been able to come up with for Bitcoin is that it's a mechanism for converting energy into financial reliability. And I agree with Robert. Like, it is a more efficient mechanism than gold is. Like in gold, you dig it out of the ground and then you have to refine it and cast it into bars, and then it goes into the vault, and then you issue certificates. That's kind of how it goes. But still, gold is more financially reliable than the political system that we have, because basically they've been trying to shortcut all that work, and they've been saying like, oh, if we just put some bearded guys in a room, like they can produce this stability, which is kind of what a lot of the altcoins have been arguing as well. It's like, we don't need this cost prohibitive proof of work. We can do it in another way with voting and things like that. So that's how I look at it, is that like, yes, gold has value because it produces this stability. Like, once you verify the gold, it's actually really scarce. It's just a bit challenging to layer societal functions on top of it, because the most efficient way is to put it in a vault. Like Fort Knox, I think, has not been audited since 1953. Like, nobody really knows what's in there. But whereas with Bitcoin, anyone who has a full node can verify any Bitcoin balance at any time. Like, that's just incredible from anywhere in the world. That is just unprecedented.
Yeah, and I do want to add something, and this is going to be this might sound a little bit heretical, but Bitcoin and gold have very different guarantees. if you look at the history of cryptography and the history of mathematics, it's very clear that there's no guarantee that the cryptography that we use in Bitcoin is not going to be broken someday. And there are problems that we can't prove are hard, which is kind of like this underlying assumption in cryptography and the primitives that make up Bitcoin. And if I had to bet money, is what's called ECDSA, is the kind of the digital signature algorithm used in Bitcoin when we're switching to another algorithm called Schnorr signatures, but it's all based on this mathematical assumption that the elliptic curve discrete log problem is hard, right? But it's irrelevant like how the math works, but that's an assumption that's protecting Bitcoin. If that assumption is ever broken through a mathematical breakthrough or a computational breakthrough, we're going to have some problems. Bitcoin's going to have to evolve and change, and there's an assumption there that it will be able to, right? Whereas gold, there are physical realities and physical guarantees and chemical properties, right? And the assumption there is that we're not going to find some cheap, inexpensive way to convert other elements into gold, right? So each of these have different assumptions in the scarcity and in the security of the asset. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind when comparing these.
Bitcoin's also changed my kind of thoughts and relationship with gold. So I looked to buy some gold recently, and the first step was people made me very fearful of the fact that I might buy something that isn't real gold, but actually trying to source physical gold, not some representation of gold in a vault somewhere. Because I hold my Bitcoin, I wanted to hold gold, and actually trying to source physical gold itself is very difficult. So that was quite an interesting to go through. Okay, so look, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of different themes going on, and I think different people are pulling in different directions based on what their priorities are, what they think the priorities are for their line of business. I'd be interested to hear from you all, and I'll start with you, Tuur. What are the kind of priorities or the things that you think you're going to be focused on with regards to Bitcoin? Where do you think you'll be spending your time? I'll just throw one in myself. Personally, I'm trying to expand myself into having conversations with people who are discussing societal issues, global issues, monetary issues, who maybe wouldn't normally talk about Bitcoin. That's where I'm going to be focused in time. But how about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be focusing basically more on just my personal life and family, and then the things that I'm working on is I'm trying to project 5 or 10 years into the future, because I think things are just going to get ugly, and it's frustrating to just look at everyday news and just see things deteriorate. But in a way, it is necessary. We have to wipe away all this debt and kind of start from scratch. So it's going to it'll have some silver linings, I think. I do want to take the opportunity, because I think it's rare to be able to talk to an audience where maybe a lot of people have not had Bitcoin exposure. Just briefly to kind of reiterate that I think Bitcoin is a self-directed insurance policy. There's a unique opportunity to get some exposure to that. And there's so much said about crypto. And to me, the essence is just buy a little bit, start with that, and then make a plan about, storage, how are you going to store it, and also think ahead, are you going to then diversify that storage? Of course, first time you buy, you store it in one place, but then I think it's a good idea to think about storing it in different places, because there is no FDIC. It's not insured. If you lose your keys or if this company goes bust, it's over. It's game over, and you have to rebuy your Bitcoin. So think about that. Also make a plan for the price. Bitcoin rallies are nothing like you've ever seen. Prices go up 10x, 100x in short periods of time. And so you want to think beforehand, what are you going to do when that happens? Also think about tax consequences. If you have a plan about selling, and make sure you know the tax consequences of what you're doing, because a lot of people got burned in 2017. I know this maybe doesn't sound likely, because Bitcoin has been, kind of moving sideways for 2 years, but I have a lot of conviction that we will see another massive rally that's going to set our hair on fire. And it's not about that, right? It's the insurance policies that's going to start paying out. That's all that it is once we see that 10 or 100x rally. So that's just something I wanted to get out there.
All right, I'll pass over to you next, Nic.
Yeah, as Tuur says, it's easy to look at the headlines and read the media and get very discouraged about the trajectory of Western civilization. It certainly looks like we're going to potentially have kind of a stagflationary decade, maybe a lost decade like Japan suffered in the 90s, and potentially a very chaotic decade characterized by a lot of political violence, which is already emerging. And I try not to focus on that. I think the important thing is we have a very small mandate here. This is a small little niche asset, but the important thing is to render it as sound and reliable as possible so that when the world needs it, it can be ready to serve. And Bitcoin is a young asset. It's still monetizing. It's unreliable in certain ways. Custody is difficult. It's challenging, but it's our job as Bitcoin enthusiasts, entrepreneurs, financiers, and content producers to help safeguard its essential properties such that it can be a truly apolitical, neutral asset for the entire world, regardless of who they are, regardless of their political affiliation or race or anything like that. It's important that it is truly neutral and that it protects the individual against the government and against any kind of domineering financial power. So that's what I see as my mandate, is helping finance those entrepreneurs that are building for that world.
Robert, yourself, you sent me a few key points in preparation for this, where you think people should be spending time on. What about yourself?
Where I'm spending time is I really think collaborative custody is super interesting, and we're going to move to this world where you will have different key quorums, like maybe for your business, for your personal, and then that sort of spins directly into inheritance planning, which I think is another very important aspect of Bitcoin. So I'm spending time for myself trying to figure that aspect out. And then two, on like the investment side, I'm really looking at financial services firms that most closely emulate the trust and minimization of the protocol. Because again, we have, everything's built on top of gold, basically paper and institutional promises built on top of gold, that we now think a lot of that will collapse to the software. The mantra in Bitcoin is don't trust, verify. So we'll move away from this need for the consumer to trust TD Ameritrade or JP Morgan because they've been around for 100 years to a model that they can just verify things cryptographically. So I think the financial services firms that provide that function will actually outcompete a lot of the legacy institutions in the space. And then, I spend a lot of time reading and writing about Bitcoin as well. I think that's very important. I think it is a complex domain. The analogy of, 6 blind guys encountering an elephant, all describing it differently. So that's kind of how we are with Bitcoin. But it's important for, as Nic said, it needs to be there when people need it. So I think the educational aspect of that is informing them of what they're dealing with and informing people of the historical circumstances we're living in. It's very easy, when we're living through it, to not understand how significant of an era we're in or how quickly things are changing. But often in retrospect, I forget who it was, said that there's decades where nothing happens and then, years where decades happen. It feels like we might be going into one of those times. And I think Bitcoin is a fulcrum to a lot of that change.
Yeah, I think that was Raoul who said that potentially. And yourself, Alex?
Yeah, so I completely agree with Robert. And we're building that financial institution at river.com. And so my focus is making it as easy as possible for people, individuals, to accumulate Bitcoin and store it with us, self-custody it, provide them the full suite of services so that they can and hold their hands from the very beginning and bringing all these new people into Bitcoin, from day one buying Bitcoin all the way to someday down the road choosing to self-custody or providing them more advanced services. And I think there's a huge opportunity there to build this financial institution that people can trust but don't have to trust. And I think the companies and the financial institutions that move in that direction are going to be the ones that last for the long term.
All right, we've got 5 minutes to go, and we've potentially got an audience, as Tuur said, that is maybe not exposed to Bitcoin right now. So got about a minute left each to talk about this, but kind of just throw out one prediction, one thing you think might happen over the next kind of 12, 24 months, and one thing you would like to see happen. I'm going to start with you, Robert.
I agree with Tuur's sentiment earlier that we are moving into a massive bull market. There are a lot of people that thought that 2017 was kind of a one-off, that we'll never see a move like that again. But if we look at Bitcoin's short history and, the macroeconomic conditions it's designed to insure against, we're in a perfect storm, frankly. Political uncertainty is at a peak. Monetary expansion is also at a peak. So I really think the next Bitcoin, because it does go through kind of psychological layers, and I know it sounds radical today, but as we know, Bitcoin does move geometrically quickly. I think when it breaks 100,000, the world's going to really have a sharp wake-up call. I think we haven't seen anything yet, so to speak. 2017 was kind of a warm-up for what's to come. If that's in 12, 24, 36 months, 5 years, who knows? But the pressures supporting its value proposition are at an all-time high.
Okay, you got about a minute, Nick.
Yeah, so what I think is likely to happen in the next 24 months is a wave of sovereign currency failures, similar to the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s, similar to in the post-Soviet Union. A lot of sovereign currencies fail. You see it at times of dollar strength. You see it at times of global dislocation. It's regional. It's contagious. We've begun to see some distress in lots of sovereign currencies when there's a lot of debt. The world is very indebted in emerging markets. And unfortunately, I think it's going to immiserate tens or hundreds of millions of people. And for some of those people, they will be able to use crypto financial rails to exit their sovereign local currency. And they can go to Bitcoin. They can go to the US dollar. There's stable coins on these rails. So I think this is going to be a big story of the next year.
Alex, over to you.
Yeah. So, honestly, I have no idea what's going to happen macroeconomically over the next year. I don't, but I do know, or I'm very confident that more and more new people to Bitcoin are going to be buying it because it serves the purpose that they see for it. And they realize that. And everyone, as we discussed, has a different story for Bitcoin, and more people are going to come to it. And that's what I know.
All right, Tuur, you get to close us out on this.
Yeah, so to me, yes, inflation is the big theme the next 12 to 24 months. The reason why is that the narrative is changing. Like, there's a step change. In 2008, the question was like, should we even have these bailouts? Right now, that's off the table. It's only about how much, how fast, and that scares me. And that's exactly what happened on the late 1780s in France, where they ended up with hyperinflation and a revolution. One way to look at the markets is like look at the lens of gold, like put that on, put your gold glasses on and look at the markets, denominate your charts in gold, and like really have a look at what's going on. That's very enlightening to me, at least. For measures of inflation, look at the Chapwood Index, which measures cost of living in the United States. Look at shadowstats.com. Like, that will show you that it's actually already 10% for the past 5 years. 2017 was a greed-driven rally in Bitcoin. 2020 and 2021, I think, is going to be driven by fear. And that is just very, very explosive. Just like we saw people stand in line to buy toilet paper and beef, I think they're going to stand in line to buy Bitcoin and gold. So the time to get insurance is before your house is on fire. And I think that's now. Like, our house is not yet on fire. We have some time to get insurance.
I think that's a perfect close. Thanks, Tuur. Listen, appreciate you all. I've got to know you all over the last 2 years. Appreciate you all coming on, joining this panel. I think it's a very interesting time for Bitcoin. I share a lot of your sentiments, especially Nick, with regard to sovereign currencies. I have my fears, but I think it was a great panel. Appreciate you all, and good luck with everything you do. All right. What do you think of that? Did you enjoy that? Bit of a monster show, right? A monster panel. But what else would you expect with a lineup like this? It actually makes me want to make more shows like this. Maybe I should start arranging some of my own. Nic, Tuur, and Robert have all been on the show before. It's definitely worth going back and checking out those shows. I've left links for those in the show notes. I haven't had Alex on before, but I would definitely get him on in a future show. I would love to talk to him more about what he thinks about Bitcoin. Again, thanks to Real Vision and Raoul Pal for letting me host these panels at their conference, giving me free reign. Really appreciated it. I think we got a couple of really good panels out of it. If you haven't checked out Real Vision, please do. It is an awesome platform. All the links are in the show notes. I really highly recommend you go and check out the content they're creating. Anyway, thanks for listening. If you do want to get in touch, you can reach out to me. It's hello@whatbitcoindid.com. Outside of that, have a great weekend, and I will see you all soon.